I'm speaking with Dr. Scott Poole, author of Wasteland, The Great War and the Origins of Modern Horror. Thanks for speaking with me.
Thank you, Chris. Very happy to be on and to talk about the Great War and really the beginnings of the horror genre.
So how did you first get started in studying and writing about horror?
Well, so really for more than a decade now, I have seen horror as a way to get into parts of the historical experience, first of the United States and then of the broader world, that really tells us some things that we are not able to find out any other way. There's actually a wonderful book that's been very influential, both just in the way I think about history and actually the way I think about this particular book, as well as my previous work. It's 1418 by Edwin Rousseau and Becker. And one of their chapters talks about the experience of historicizing grief, and the idea that grief is not something that we normally think of as a historical topic. I believe very much the same thing about horror, the idea of the monster. And my interest in that really grows out in part out of my own personal interest in horror film. I mean, I'm a horror nerd going back to the 1970s when I was a little kid, but have been lucky enough to find a way to bring that together with my teaching interests and my writing. Actually, in my teaching at the College of Charleston, I teach a course called American Monsters, which is just a regular course in our history curriculum that talks about everything from folk tales from the colonial era to, slasher films in the 1980s to, found footage horror and the new creature features and the new spiritualist horror in the present. So it's a lifelong interest that I've been able to bring together with what I study.
Mm-hmm. So let's talk about the book. What does it discuss?
Well, so in my view, the Great War just tore a hole in the world. I actually don't think that we have 100 years now, almost after the armistice, a real sense of what happened between 1914 and 1918. And I think that the reason for that is actually that it began sort of this piling on of wreckage that has continued down to the present. So as a historian, I'm interested really in two things in the book. On the one hand, talking about the long-term experience of the war, the long-term effects of the war, the effects of the war on the men who fought the war, the men and women who were civilians who suffered from it in the tens of millions, and then connecting that with a new kind of popular culture, which was really horror as we know it. Now, I don't mean by that there had not been, macabre tales before. There certainly had been. I'm great fans of many of them, but the nature of horror changed in some very significant ways because of some very particular directors, screenwriters, authors, and artists that the book, in a way, forms a kind of collective biography of.
So one thing that comes to mind, in addition to the Great War, I think the Great War also fomented the Spanish flu epidemic right as it was ending. I think it killed a huge number of people in the world in sort of
absolutely.
A horrific way. I'm wondering, does the flu also, is that rolled into the horror of the war?
That's certainly part of it. I talk about the influenza epidemic and the numbers of civilians that it took. I think, though, that one part of my interpretation and a number of historians of the early 20th century in general think about it in these terms is that, in the past it was normal to talk about World War I, the interwar period, and then World War II. And as you probably know, now there's more of a almost sort of 30 years war discussion of that particular period. Mm-hmm. And so, within several years after the supposed end of the Great War, we've got a war between the Soviet Union and Poland with 200,000 casualties, a war between Greece and the Ottoman Empire, or Turkey rather, that produces another 250,000 casualties. And so when you have then the production of films like J'accuse, which is in some way sort of the first zombie film, even though they're not the zombie army film, even though they're not called this. Mm-hmm. Films like Nosferatu, films like The Cabinet of Dr. Caligari, and then all of those films, coming over to America with the Universal Studios productions, you're really seeing various kinds of reflections on what is happening to the world, and in particular what's happening to human beings, because I do think that one thing and I mean the individual human being, the individual human body, mm-hmm. because I do think that actually one thing that horror fans today would recognize looking back at the 1920s and 1930s is the fascination with body horror of different kinds. Mm-hmm. The terror of the corpse that has not been buried properly, since proper burial was not really a possibility in the Great War and the wars that followed. And so, I certainly think of, the book talks a little bit about influenza, but the focus is really very much on the role of violence and the role of violence to the human body, and how people try to represent that, not simply to sort of deal with it psychologically, but to actually kind of confront themselves and their audiences with the reality of what had happened.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think at least for Britain, in the Great War went from being a noble endeavor to just a horrific bloodbath, and they learned that very quickly, I think. Britain at least did.
I think that's absolutely true. I will add as a side note that I continue to be astonished. I think most people who think about the war are astonished with the fact that it continued for 4 years with not just conscripts, but people continuing to volunteer to go and fight after the reality of the trenches became known. This is really extraordinary, and I've actually compared it to in talking with students to try to get them to think about what the numbers of casualties, the millions of casualties, would have meant in a pre-1944-45 era. It's as if multiple atomic weapons were triggered in Europe over a number of years. I mean, it was that level of catastrophe, a level of catastrophe that, while we have seen larger numbers, we have not had, or Western cultures and cultures around the world, actually, in Africa and in Asia, have not really experienced since. So, to me, it makes a great deal of sense that, within 10 years, you have films like Paul Lenny's The Man Who Laughs, that's, really a story about a mutilated body. Frankenstein itself, which is not the story of a reanimated corpse, but rather a kind of mountain of corpses that, James Whale himself, as a second lieutenant in the British Army, would have experienced and would have known.
So can you name, so you've named a few films, can you name some more works, literature, authors and such, and also movie directors or producers who created some of this?
Yeah, certainly. I talk about quite a number in the book. So what I'll do is just mention 3 or 4 that I think might be of particular interest to your listeners, but also that perhaps they haven't thought of in relation to the idea of horror. So, for example, the book actually spends a good bit of time with Fritz Lang. Who, of course, is best known for Metropolis in 1927, which walks the line between horror and science fiction. There's a mad scientist that practices the occult, but at the same time there's a android double that at the same time is a kind of gothic double that that Edgar Allan Poe would have recognized. Mm-hmm. And Lang's own war experience, which was quite horrible. He was in the Austro-Hungarian army. He was wounded 3 times. He returned so traumatized by the conflict that in the first few years after the war ended, as his directing career kind of gets off the ground, he actually became known for having these terrible fits of anger that would involve him waving around his service revolver as if he were back in the trenches. Mm-hmm. And then Lang, of course, makes this incredible film M, mm-hmm. Which in some ways is the first serial killer movie. When we watch Psycho, when we watch Peeping Tom, and from 1960, they're really looking back to 1931's M. So Lang is an example. I previously wrote a biography of H.P. Lovecraft, and some of the material about his fascination with the Great War that did not make it into that particular book can be found here, especially some of his nonfiction writings actually about his interest and understanding of the war, where that took him in the 1920s and 30s politically. And also just, I think, I think for the first time in some ways, I'm going to just kind of immodestly say that I think I've noticed to what a degree the Great War played a role in both his early fiction and what we think of as more of the classic period after the Call of Cthulhu. I don't know that the Call of Cthulhu could have been written in a world that the Great War had not occurred. I think finally, just because it's gonna, to some of your listeners and maybe to you, Chris, it's gonna sound a bit out of left field, but Franz Kafka actually plays an important role in the book, and I am part of what I'm doing there is trying to. As every horror fan knows, our hobby is often seen as pretty lowbrow and disreputable and maybe a bit trashy even. And, Kafka, on the other hand, that's sort of like the heights of, literary modernism or however one decides to place him. And yet Kafka to me is writing, very, very terrifying tales. Not only, his most famous Metamorphosis. You have this transformation of a human being into an insect, which suggests everything from the work of William Burroughs to, B films like the original Fly. But also just telling terrible tales that are less known, like in the Penal Colony, which Eli Roth could make a film of. I mean, it's a kind of it's a kind of 1910s, 1920s torture porn in a way. And so, and this is not going to make everyone happy. I don't know how horror fans will feel about it. I do know how a lot of literary critics will feel about it. But I don't, to me, the horror genre is not just this dead end alley and some things fit in it and some don't. I mean, I think that, most of us who really live these films and these books and horror culture, we know it when we see it. I mean, we know it when we experience it.
Yeah, I've read a fair bit of Kafka many years ago, and at a minimum, his stuff is disturbing. Even if you're not willing to say it's horror.
Oh yeah, absolutely, and I think And there are elements, I think, in it that I think, again, because of the allegedly lowbrow nature of horror, have just kind of been skipped. I mean, in The Castle, his unfinished novel, The Castle, there's these sort of clear supernatural elements. The castle seems to move. It's day and then it's suddenly night, and other things that he just sort of leaves there. He's also been very influential on one of my favorite contemporary horror authors that I've written about before, Thomas Ligotti, whose work is, to me at least, really hard to imagine without Kafka.
So you mentioned briefly the occult. How did people's interest and approach to the occult change after the Great War, and did it impact the creation of these movies and literature?
Oh, it absolutely did, and it is in some ways such a strange story, because you have at the same time an upsurge of interest in the occult, and in fact a kind of what you could call a renewal of a spiritualism, the notion of working with mediums to contact the dead. And that idea had been around for a long time. That wasn't a creation of the Great War itself. And you also would expect it to essentially reemerge during the Great War. I mean, people are losing loved ones by the millions. As Freud pointed out with his own sons in the Austro-Hungarian army, death is not an abstract idea anymore. It is something that lives with us every day. And so, the interest in spiritualism is not surprising. What is surprising is that spiritualism takes on a really new meaning. So, whereas before, you might go to a seance frequently, you might go to a medium frequently if you were involved in the spiritualist movement. The purpose becomes in the Great War era and right after to really just get a single message from the beloved dead that I'm fine, everything's good. I'm in one of the most popular spiritualist texts of the time. I'm in a place called Summerland, and that's it. And to me, this is connected to just the realities of the war, in which it was both impractical, but at the same time, by the populace in Britain and France and Germany, to some degree, even in the United States, when the U.S. finally enters the war, there was just this impossibility and lack of interest in retrieving the corpse of the dead. And this is sort of shocking, because for the last 100 years, not just in Britain, but in the Germanys and the Habsburg lands, there was so much sentimentality that surrounded the body and the proper burial of the body, and that just disappears overnight. And I think that's both for practical reasons and also the desire not to see what modern combat did to the body. Something that was very significant in terms of the wounded as well. And so, spiritualism really becomes a way to deal with that sentiment, to say goodbye to the dead. But it's significant to me that it really is just saying goodbye. And that suggests to me what we see in the films and fiction of the next 30, one could argue, 100 years, where we've gone back to this almost primal sense of, the terror of the dead returning. We don't want their messages. And there's something in that in the interest in the occult.
Do you see in these creations after the Great War, do you see the influence of nihilism or pessimism, this anger that grew out, this emotional anger? Do you see that influence on horror?
Yes, I think that, one of the things that's absolutely essential in understanding everything from filmmakers to artists, I think of artists especially with this, but it's true of the films as well. Most of the people that I talk about are veterans or have been affected by the war in a really direct way, and they are furious, and they're furious at the possibility that anyone could or would create a sentimental sort of gauze to go over the war. And so part of the point of an artist, a surrealist artist like Max Ernst, a German veteran who himself was wounded numerous times, the reason that he is painting bodies that, they look like something out of the mind of Clive Barker. They are horrifying representations. They're like something that, those of us who, played the Silent Hill games back in the day, would recognize, and perhaps that borrowed from him in some ways. And that was a really furious attempt, to force those who had not seen the horror of the Great War to experience it. Mm-hmm. You see this in many of some of the poets that I talk about, who often write something like horror poetry. Siegfried Sassoon's very famous British veteran who wrote poetry about the war. He's even angry about some of the monuments that are built, the famous Menin Gate, the East Gate in Ypres, which he calls in one of his poems a sepulchre of crime, and does so in using kind of the language of horror. He imagines a situation in which, as he says, the dead would rise from their slime and call down curses on this sepulchre of crime. And so I think that, just in almost every person that I examined, I suppose in every director, writer, poet, filmmaker that I look at, that there is that very, very deep sense that we want to confront the public with what has happened. We don't want to allow them to forget what has happened to us. And we, on some level, also don't want to forget what we did. This is, of course, always part of the trauma of war. There's the savagery that is done to soldiers. There's the savagery that soldiers commit. And they have to deal with both. Mm-hmm.
Are you familiar with an author named Celine, who was...
Yes, I am.
And I'm curious...
Celine plays actually a fairly significant role in the chapter on the emergence of fascism as a kind of form of horror in the 1930s, yes. But yes, he writes really the definitive French novel of the war.
Mm-hmm. Now, I don't recall horror elements in it, but it certainly felt as though there were ghosts everywhere.
Yeah, there's not only ghosts, there's bodies torn apart. There's, one of the reasons that, that his book, Journey to the End of the Night, became what it became is that, it, for the French people is that it seemed like it was telling a true story of the war. And it also, interestingly, given his later political direction, it did not glorify the veteran. He actually portrays himself and many of his fellows as, we were terrified, we deserted when we got the chance. The character Ferdinand, that's clearly modeled on him, actually deserts several times, in the course of the book. But that's in a section of the book that deals with sort of the, in some ways, more insidious uses of horror in the 1930s. Celine takes this hard right turn. And by the late 30s is writing anti-Semitic pamphlets, is enormous supporter of Adolf Hitler and then of the Vichy regime, to the point that his literary fame in France today is quite controversial.
Right. Now, I wonder if also, as a consequence of the war, there was a huge amount of death and destruction of animals, horses, farm animals, just, pets. And Does that kind of death figure into the horror that comes out of the Great War?
To some degree. I mean, I think that is it's interesting that you mentioned that, because I was struck in my research for the book how often that becomes kind of a footnote in these discussions when, for example, during the Battle of Verdun in 1916, in which, by this time, by 1916, as you well know, I mean, horses are not being used as cavalry. They're being used only to, try to resupply Maxim guns and that sort of thing. Field artillery, field artillery. But, 7,000, horses are killed in the first, few months of the war. And it certainly, I think, had a great deal of effect on, for example, French directors like Georges Franju, who, in The Blood of the Beasts, creates this sort of neo-realist horror film of the slaughterhouse, with the suggestion that, this is a kind of a metaphor for the human experience. Franju's most famous for later the later film Eyes Without a Face, this kind of formative post-war French horror film. So yeah, it's certainly there. I think also generally forgotten, and this makes the casualty counts for the Great War almost impossible to figure. I mean, the number you generally hear is 16 million dead, but the numbers of civilians and how one counts the civilian dead, whether it's even possible, the level of brutality that was practiced against civilians on both by the Allies and the Central Powers. This is something that I highlight in the book, in part just to, as we have to in writing about these things, to kind of bear witness to it. But also, I think this created a population that was ready for films filled with body horror, that was ready to see Nosferatu rise from the dead, that was ready to see bodies compared to waxworks in the film Waxworks, that was ready for Frankenstein in 1931 and then in Bride in 1935.
So let's turn to how you did your research. Can you tell me how you, obtained the films and, got access to the films? I mean, and what did you use?
Yeah, well, so there were several different sources. So I did spend some time in France and Belgium. I was unable to make it to the Imperial War Museum, although I was lucky in that so much of their material is digitized, as so many so much primary sources are. And so the book actually intertwines veterans' accounts with the stories of the life of people like Fritz Lang, F.W. Murnau, Celine, Salvador Dali, who had a very strange experience in the post-war era, artists like Otto Dix of Germany, who's not particularly well known, but I hope will become more well known, and Kafka. And then the films, I'm pleased to say that most of the films that I needed to work with were available in very good prints. It's a bit of a challenge to find the 1919 version of Abel Gance's J'accuse, which I do talk a good bit about, because of this extraordinary scene, really, at the end of the film where, the dead rise and march and sort of demand of the living, what have you done to us? Why has our sacrifice not been remembered? But it actually is also available YouTube, New Motion, other sites of that type. So actually, one of the things that I'm hoping with the book is that people who don't know these films, horror fans who don't know these films, will go back to them. I think that they're going to be pleasantly surprised and for a horror fan, pleasantly shocked at just how strange and deeply disturbing and actually truly frightening many of these films are, particularly seen against the backdrop of the times.
Did you discover any piece of literature or movie that you hadn't originally thought knew about that maybe you came across?
Actually, so this is going back a bit to Jacques.
Mm-hmm.
I was aware of the very strange story that I tell in the book of the original making of the film in 1918, in which veterans from Verdun actually play the zombie army. Many of whom then went, this was made in the summer of 18, so many of them then went back to die before the armistice in November. So I knew that strange story. I actually was not aware, somewhat to my embarrassment, that Abel Gance 20 years later remade the film. For some people, a much more famous version of the film because it's much more generally available. And actually accentuated the supernatural elements, made his Army of the Dead much more spectral, the sort of marching skeletons, even more use of double exposure and superimposition techniques, and made it into actually much more of an anti-war film. I will mention that another surprise that I had, just because I had never been able to sort of bear to sit down and watch it, even though in some of my classes we cover this era. One of the very interesting things that I think that readers will be fascinated by and think about a long time what it means is that in this this terribly anti-Semitic propaganda film, The Eternal Jew, which was produced by Goebbels and the Reich Ministry of Propaganda in 1940. It was shown to SS troops that were being sent with the mobile killing units after the invasion of Poland. The number of clips that were used from various horror film from the Weimar era, and the strangest example of that was the use of Fritz Lang's M and images of Peter Lorre, who by that time was living in exile and starring in horror films in the United States. Because of his Jewish background, he had had to flee Germany, as so many did in 1933. And they actually use an image of him from Fritz Lang, who also had fled, in that film to illustrate their anti-Semitic point. And they in fact even put him on the poster for The Eternal. So you have this very strange situation in which he is a star of the Weimar era. He's also the serial murderer from M. He's also exactly the image that the fascists, the Nazis, in this particular case, want to show as kind of the very face of degeneracy, a justification for the Holocaust.
That must have been depressing for the man.
I actually looked for comments that he made about it. It's very interesting. He was an incredibly interesting person, very learned man, actually. And yet never really wished to speak very much. Certainly not in comparison to Fritz Lang, who liked to talk kind of all the time about leaving Germany and the aftermath. But Peter Lorre really did not. And yet I think it's interesting that he continued to star in sort of these dark roles that hint at his time playing out these characters on the The Haunted Screen is a German film scholar called German Films in the 20s and early 30s.
When did the first comedy horror come out? And for some reason, Abbott and Costello popped in my mind.
Right.
I don't know why.
Yeah, so you're absolutely on track there, I think, because, there's kind of two stories there. The short version is that, by the late 1940s, you have Abbott and Costello meeting everybody from Frankenstein to The Invisible Man to The Mummy. And you have kind of the traditional, truly terrifying monsters for people of the early 30s being played for laughs. But there's kind of another interesting story with that, in that people like Harold Lloyd, actors like Harold Lloyd, even Buster Keaton had starred in one. They had starred in the early 20s in America in essentially some old dark house films, and played kind of entirely for laughs. Ghost spooks them. Turns out to be, there's kind of the Scooby-Doo explanation where it's like the cousin trying to get the property and that sort of thing. But what's strange about it is that in the years after the Great War, in the late 20s, by the time you have European directors like the German director Paul Lenny leaving Germany, James Whale coming to the United States, the old dark house film takes on a much more serious tone and actually begins, for example, in Paul Lenny's version of Cat and the Canary, you can see in it really all of the themes of German cinema, the seance, the ghost, the medium. And that's a film, I think, that when horror fans revisit, they'll be quite excited by, because there's really some, for one thing, very beautifully terrifying shots. There is a suggestion of the real supernatural, as well as, what's sometimes called the explained supernatural. And the same is certainly true of James Whale's Old Dark House, that makes reference to the Great War directly. Actually, one of the main characters of that film, possibly two. In one case, it's a little oblique. In another case, it's very direct. But they are veterans of the Great War who have been in different ways damaged by what happened to them in it. So it's sort of interesting that in American film, you sort of start with the old spooky house being played for laughs. But then when Europeans who've been influenced by the war come to Hollywood, that changes. Eventually, in the late 1940s, the horror film begins to become escapist again in many respects.
What did you find most enjoyable in the research for this book?
I have to tell you that I found almost nothing enjoyable about researching this book. And I know that sounds terrible, but I have almost nothing good to say other than my enjoyment and love of these films and some of the directors. James Whale is particularly beloved to me, so I'm liable to go home and watch part of his oeuvre tonight. Fritz Lang is wonderful. Mr. Murnau is wonderful. But I don't know. I don't wish to sound melodramatic, but I really suffered with this book, and in ways I didn't expect to, and in ways I never really have with a book before. I don't know that this will particularly encourage anyone to read it, but I can remember in sort of the last year of work just honestly just being filled with dread, just that okay, it's time to get up and write, because it just seemed like I was facing a mound of corpses every single day, and it is impossible for me, even as a historian, to part of what you asked about my research, I mean, part of it was actually just bicycling around Ypres, for example, the Ypres salient. And, there was, there's no way that if one, contemplates that era and spends a lot of time with the men and women that suffered during that era, there's no way that one can simply be a sort of historical tourist in experiencing those kinds of things. So other than my love for the directors and many of the artists and many of the writers, I mean, as far as the material itself, I really hated it.
No, I understand. It's stressful, it sounds like.
It was. Yeah, I have bad dreams about this book, which again is not really a selling point. But I almost in some ways, if I can be totally honest, I almost in some ways after I completed it, and especially the boxes arrive and there the book is, and it's exciting, or it's supposed to be. But I almost had the sense that I had written a kind of a bad book. And not bad aesthetically, I hope, but just a book that I wondered if the world needed it.
Well, it sounds like it does. To just be more aware of human suffering, if nothing else.
I hope that that's the response. It's not an easy path. I think it's a book that gives the reader a path to walk, and a way to. I think that by the end to find their way sort of out of the forest of it, but I don't promise an easy path.
Sounds like you sort of entered a literary version of a Lovecraft world, right there.
I don't know if that line from Call of Cthulhu, the blossoms of spring will forever be poison to me. I don't know if it's quite that bad. I think that there is so much power in what the men and women of that generation were able to create in response to the catastrophe of the war and the catastrophe of their lives, that one has encountered something that is much larger than oneself and one's own life, and that will stay with you.
Was there anything you found in your research that was especially surprising that you didn't expect, apart from your emotional reaction?
I was surprised. I knew that Bela Lugosi, this is a small fact in some respects, but in other respects it says a great deal. And some of this I'll leave readers to, I won't tell the whole story, I'll leave it for readers to learn about it. But I knew about Bela Lugosi's service in the Austro-Hungarian army. I even knew that he had actually served at one point in the elite ski patrol, had been wounded. I was not aware of some of the absolutely horrific things that had happened to him. That he really only talked about, and it was actually this was very difficult to give up or to discover, because there was so much that family members, Bela Lugosi Jr., for example, others really didn't want to really talk about with regard to that experience, because they didn't want to take away from. They felt that he already had sort of been cheated in some ways out of his Hollywood stardom. And so, they didn't want to add all this other kind of extra baggage of the war. But it was incredibly interesting, and it made me understand him. It made me understand the roles that he was attracted to. I think that it made me understand a bit more about all of the things that people who worked with Lugosi talked about in terms of his reserve, his unwillingness to speak on the set, kind of engage with other actors. Often that's been, it's been explained with, well, he he couldn't speak English well, or he was embarrassed by his accent. And I think that once readers find out both his experience during the war and then his brief time back home in Hungary, in Budapest, after the war, I think they'll understand Lugosi better, and I know that they'll never be able to watch Dracula the same way again.
Wow. Was there a question or an issue that was particularly difficult to come to a conclusion on, or maybe you still haven't solved?
I think that, one issue that remains for me is really not related to the war itself or to the immediate aftermath or to all of these artists and thinkers that we've been discussing. It's really more a question about our own memory and forgetfulness in relation to the war. And I think, this may be something that is sort of back to your question about, things I was surprised by. I was surprised and remain surprised. I actually remain surprised with this regarding veterans of World War II, Korea, Vietnam, Iraq, and Afghanistan. The idea that we can and do glorify the idea of the veteran in memorial, on special days of celebration, while also completely forgetting about, and in some respects even shunting aside, the actual veterans, often because their physical and psychological wounds are too deep for people for civilians essentially to really want to deal with. And I still wonder, I guess I do wonder why that happened so quickly, why on the very first Armistice Day, the French public is horrified when they see sort of the first column of veterans, some of whom have horrible facio-dental wounds, many of whom are amputees, why they sort of drew back from that. While at the same time, the abstract notion of the veteran remains so important, and we see that in the United States as well, where this is sort of hard to believe, but there's actually more statues built to the doughboy, the World War I doughboy, than individual figures of any other war. That's including the American Civil War, where we think about all the monuments. But then the treatment of the actual veterans, the actual sort of breaking of the promise of the government to essentially pay off the war bonds that they had been issued. This resulting in the bonus army in the early 1930s. While at the same time, as I quoted in my book, you have people writing about from everyone from the American Legion to various kinds of women's magazines about our veterans need to be memorialized, but we're a cheerful people and we don't look back, and so it's very sad that all these terrible things happened, but let's get on with things.
Yeah.
And I think that I actually have a hope, and I don't know if this will happen, but I do have a hope that particularly veterans of the Iraq and Afghanistan conflicts will find their way to this book. I think that they're going to find some things in the book that resonate with their own experience and our rather quick forgetfulness of them, and actually forgetfulness that they exist in some ways.
Yeah. So, did you have any difficulties getting the book published? You talked about, writing it, the difficulties in writing it, but as far as publication, any issues there?
No, I didn't actually. I've been an author with Counterpoint for a number of years now. This is actually the third book that I've published with Counterpoint and their various imprints. That they're an extraordinary press, and even a topic that they have not explored before, like this one. Mm-hmm. They in fact publish a lot of fiction as well as nonfiction, political nonfiction. They just sort of gave me incredible freedom to kind of go for it and turn it into what I wanted it to be. So my really kind of long-term relationship with them, no problems with publication at all.
What's your next writing project?
I haven't decided. I guess from what I said earlier, it sounds like I need to get over this book first. But I actually have a couple of things I'm thinking about, and don't want to give away the store too much. But I do have an idea of going back to my book, Monsters in America, which has a revised edition coming out this year. It first came out in 2011. Mm-hmm. And actually thinking a little bit, this may be looking at sort of the other end of things, thinking a little bit more about horror in the last 20 years, especially sort of horror since the millennium, horror in America since 9/11, and maybe horror more internationally as well, since that certainly is an interest of mine. That's that is still in the discussion and sort of thinking through it phase. There certainly is quite a number of things that I'm interested in. I'm a person who has sort of 6 books that they'd like to write right now, and so it takes me a little bit of time to find something that I'm really going to both involve myself in passionately and that is, as Wasteland did, break my heart a little bit as well.
So where will people be able to find the book, and where can they find your writings on social media?
Oh, yeah, certainly. Yeah, certainly. So the book is going to be generally available everywhere. My preference is that the book be purchased from a person's favorite independent bookstore. Independent bookstores have been big supporters of me always, and so I am of them. Both the concrete stores and places like IndieBound. But it's available everywhere, and also people can find me online. I tweet at Monsters America, simply at Monsters America, and a lot of the kind of op-ed pieces, short pieces, essays, other kinds of things are available there. And none of my books since 2009, when I've really been sort of dealing with the horror genre, are out of print. So they really are all available. The Lovecraft biography is widely available, and was a Bram Stoker finalist. And so yeah, I think that I'm pretty easy to find. I hope so.
Okay. That's all the questions I have. Do you have any final thoughts?
Okay. No, I don't think so. Those were actually wonderful questions. So, and a lot of exactly the kinds of things that I wanted to talk about. So, good. Thank you again for the time.
All right. Well, thank you. Thank you for listening. Don't forget to visit chrisalvarez.com or theartofsciencefiction.com for more great interviews, photos, and articles. Your visits help support this podcast. Please remember that my first name, Chris, does not have an H in it. One of the best ways to provide feedback for this podcast is to rate me on iTunes. Please give me a good rating if you liked it, or feel free to give me a bad rating if you didn't. I'll use that feedback to make this a better podcast. You can also follow me on Instagram under Chris Alvarez Sci-Fi, on Facebook under Chris Alvarez WLC, on YouTube under Chris Alvarez WLC, and on Twitter under Chris Alvarez WLC. Thanks for listening, and keep imagining the future.